attention to the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center towers in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and a whole lot more. This is 9/11 Free Fall. Hi everyone, this is Andy Steele. Once again, I'm happy to be back for another show. Today, Jonathan Cole is back on, and so is Dr. Timothy Eastman. They're going to talk about their new paper titled WTC Destruction, an analysis of peer-reviewed technical literature. We talked about it briefly last week, and we'll be talking about it more this week, along with many other things. So stay tuned for that. We'll be getting to that interview very shortly. Now, if this is the first episode of this show you've ever heard, 9/11 Free Fall is about 9/11 truth, highlighting the science behind 9/11 truth, and while bringing on people who have contributed to the important cause of exposing the fact that the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7 were brought down in a controlled demolition on September 11th. Government officials and many members of the corporate media have decided for the American people that this is a fact that we don't need to know about. Despite this, however, more and more Americans do know about this reality, and strangely enough, the gatekeepers are continuing their bizarre suppression of the evidence and refuse to engage in any real discussion about the scientific facts of that day. But we are forcing the issue and gaining ground every day, and they don't know what to do about it. All right, it's like watching a band that only knows how to play one tune. People are scratching their heads watching this, and the corporate media's facade is slowly falling. Of course, much of the research that lays the foundation for 9/11 science truth comes from architects and engineers for 9/11 truth. This is a nonprofit organization that I talk about every week on this show that has been leading the way when it comes to the science and hard evidence that disproves the government's official story for why the buildings in New York were destroyed. The 2 movies that you need to find and bookmark right now are Blueprint for Truth and 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. These are the movies that lay it on the table and are waking people up left and right. All right, they were put out by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth over the past couple of years, and along with the 15-minute video called Solving the Mystery of Building 7, and that movie is a quick intro to the matter for folks who can only spare a few minutes to find out the real reason why the world changed 11 years ago. And I don't mention this enough on the show, folks, but you can find these movies also by going to 911freefall.com and watching them for free. All right, these movies will wake you up, and then when you're ready to take action, you can buy some cheap DVD versions of the movies in bulk at ae911truth.org and hand them out on the street. Seriously, folks, not many people will pass up free DVDs when you hand them to them. But don't just limit your outreach to handing out movies, okay? You got a brain and you have energy in your body for a reason, and it's not just to play basketball or rollerblade. And don't get me wrong, those things are fun and life is meant to be enjoyed while you're here, but your society is under attack by a lie that permeates and undermines the freedom and safety that once protected you. And when that happens, it's the duty of every citizen everywhere to use their talents to expose that lie and restore normalcy and truth to public discourse once again. I can't state it enough, folks. People died on 9/11. All right, they don't get to enjoy this beautiful spring weather we now have here in New York. They don't get to move along and cover their eyes from this issue. Now the evidence proves we were lied to about what killed them, and in all likelihood, who killed them. And this is not something we can afford to look away from. After all, the next time it could be you or your kids who are the victims of a lie this big. The good news is, though, you don't have to stand alone in exposing this lie. You can relieve some of that stress by joining a team and volunteering at ae911truth.org. All right, there you'll have the support and guidance that you need, and you will stand with great activists who will have your back. So you just have to click the volunteer tab on the right-hand side and sign up. Again, that's ae911truth.org. Go there right now. Okay, some quick 9/11 related news. We got a great new article up at ae911truth.org written by Chris Sarnes. The title of the article is Fraud Exposed in NIST WTC 7 Reports, Part 1. And that Part 1 shows you there's more to come, and these will be coming out over the next 5 months, apparently. And, of course, an article like this is very important because there are some people who still wonder if NIST report does equate to fraud or if the people at NIST are just remarkably ignorant and unfit to hold their jobs. Now, in this first installment, Chris Sarnes tackles the fires that had already burned out in key areas by the time World Trade Center 7 was pulled, which NIST fraudulently claims were raging despite photographic evidence to the contrary. There's other issues he addresses regarding the fire in Building 7 in this article, so you need to check out the article right now. Then you got to share it on social media and put it in your blog. It's a quick read, but worth the time spent. So again, that's at ae911truth.org at the very top. Also, we have this news from a website called the Algemeiner. It's titled 9/11 Conspiracy Theorists Removed from UN Panel After Benign Birth Request. And it's a very brief article about how a former MI5 intelligence officer named Annie Macho was pulled from a UN panel discussion in New York that's set for June the 6th. And this is because Benign Birth International, which is supposedly a Jewish human rights group, made a big stink about the fact that she openly believes that 9/11 was orchestrated by the U.S. government as a pretext for war. And I guess she has also expressed that she thinks Mossad was behind the 1994 attack on the Israeli embassy in London. And, of course, that ruffled this particular group's feathers pretty good. Now, we don't get into that latter issue here on the show, but that's just to go to show you some of the other background with this story. But they're pulling her from this panel, business as usual, protected the big lie, boiled down every discussion about world events to this kind of phony, polite chit-chat. And when somebody, or some group complains that they don't like a person's particular analysis on a subject, you give them the hook, okay? And this is just another example, and it's self-censorship. It's that mass peer pressure that we always talk about on this show. It chills people from wanting to speak out. In other news, they put the spire on top of the new Freedom Tower in New York, which is replacing the iconic World Trade Center towers. And they're trying to play this up in the media as a rebuilding from 9/11 victory moment, but in reality, and this is my opinion, but in reality, this thing is nothing other than a monument to lies. And the fact that they call it the Freedom Tower when we had our freedoms diminished after 9/11, of course, is a joke. All right, the joke is on all of us, folks. And I kind of feel like the Freedom Tower is the fly in the soup of Manhattan, reminding you how dirty this all is. All right, now it's just a building, of course. It can stand for freedom, but there has to be real freedom. Freedom from this lie. And that has to exist first for this building to have any kind of real symbolic meaning attached to it. Otherwise, it's just something in the way there. So that is our news. Now, what we're going to do at this moment, we're going to do what we do every week. We're going to take about 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and everybody who has died in the wars that followed 9/11. So we're going to take those 10 seconds right now. All right, and that is 10 seconds. Okay, like I said before, our guests today are Jonathan Cole and Tim Eastman. Jonathan Cole is a registered professional engineer who graduated from the University of Connecticut with a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering. He was one of many expert witnesses that presented at the Toronto hearings on the 10th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. He is probably best known for his experimental videos using the scientific method to validate or disprove various 9/11 theories. His videos are on YouTube under the name Physics and Reason, and collectively have been viewed over 500,000 times, and he has almost 3,000 subscribers. And some of his more popular videos include Mysterious Eutectic Steel, The Great Thermate Debate, and his most recent Expert versus Expert. And he shares a website with David Chandler called www.911speakout.org, where you can find all of his videos. And we have Dr. Timothy Eastman. Dr. Eastman has a Ph.D. in physics and geophysics from the University of Alaska, graduated in 1979. He's currently a consultant in plasma sciences in Silver Spring, Maryland. He has provided key leadership of the nation's research programs in space plasma physics, while he was a branch chief for space physics at NASA headquarters and program director for space physics at National Science Foundation. He has published 100 research papers in space physics and related fields, and has conceived and edited 2 special issues on process thought and natural science published in the journal Process Studies. He's also published a book titled Physics and Whitehead. He is a signatory of the petition at Scientists for 9/11 Truth that challenged the official account of the events of September 11, 2001, in particular the official account of the destruction of the World Trade Center buildings provided by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And of course, Scientists for 9/11 Truth, I've talked about it before on the show. We've had guests from there. Their webpage is scientistsfor911truth.org. It's spelled exactly how it sounds. Guys, thank you for coming on 9/11 Freefall.
Well, thank you, Andy. Thank you for the invitation again.
Now, Tim,
yes,
this is the first time on the show. Can you briefly talk about what woke you up to this issue with 9/11 and prompted you to start studying it and speaking out about it?
Well, as you've noted, my specialty is space physics and space plasma physics, and that has been the dominant focus of most of my research career. But in the last 15 years, approximately, I began doing more work in also philosophy of science and and history and philosophy of science. And in that, you mentioned a couple references I put together in that topic. And during that time, I got to know Professor David Griffin. In his hat as being a noted philosopher at Claremont Lincoln University, and of course now in emeritus. And it was over a dinner with David that I, back in 2005, I believe it was, where these issues were raised, and we briefly discussed it, and that really picked up my interest, and I didn't know what to respond because I had such great trust in the integrity and quality of his work that I thought I really had to evaluate this for myself, and that's what I did. So it took me many months, even a year, to really digest it all and to come to sort of conclusion for myself. But that's what instigated it, was that direct encounter and discussion with Professor Griffin.
Well, Professor Griffin's been responsible for waking up a lot of people, and it's interesting you say 2005, and we're going to get to this a little bit because you guys kind of mentioned this, that year 2005 in your paper. But there seems to be a lot of people that woke up around that time, myself included. That kind of 2-year span from 2005 to 2007. It's pretty interesting. Now, Jonathan, we've had you on this show before. It was a great episode, and anyone who wishes to listen can go back in our archives. But beyond the description I just gave you, can you briefly tell the audience about yourself and your own findings regarding the 9/11 event?
Well, sure. As you mentioned, I'm a civil engineer, and I actually own and operate a small civil engineering firm. And the way that I sort of got into this thing, I was like everybody else in the world. I just believed what I was told. Even the day of the event, I think somebody in my office said, gee, can that really happen? And I just kind of shrugged my shoulders and I said, well, I guess it just did. And frankly, I didn't see it till even later than Tim Eastman. I didn't see it until late 2007. And the minute I saw it, and I really looked at how those buildings, especially the Twin Towers, came down, it just struck me like a ton of bricks, if you will, that there was something horribly wrong with what we were told about this. And so I think, like virtually everybody else, I just started first trying to debunk it. And then the further I dug into it, the more I realized that a lot of the issues out there have not been debunked at all. Rather, they're more like straw man arguments that are knocked down, but they're not real scientific investigations. So anyhow, it was late 2007, and then all through 2008, I looked at this thing, and I, as we talked about in the last show here, I decided to try to do something about it, and that was to do something that other people haven't done too much of, and that was the whole experimental end of this thing, to either prove or disprove what might have happened.
Right, and we're going to have some of those videos up on 911freefall.com, links to them in this archive, along with, obviously, the previous archive as well, because these are things that people really need to see. They need to, you go right through the scientific method, and you do the job that NIST should have done with your own resources. It's absolutely amazing, and these are videos that need to be spread, just like the other videos I talk about on the show. These need to be spread for everyone to see. It's very, I don't want to say simplistic, but it's very simple to understand. And I get it. Anybody can get it. Anyone with common sense can get it once they see it laid out for them. Now, I'm just curious, Tim, for you, what was the strongest bit of evidence that really that you find that really calls into question the official account of the building collapses in New York?
Well, this came up, so to speak, in association with the website that John refers to, 911speakout.org, that he worked on with David Chandler, of course, initiated by David Chandler. And so I was very slow to kind of pull this together and very much involved in my other work and so forth. And but after, coming back and when I began to see David Chandler's work in more detail just a few years ago. I mean, quite a bit of time after 2005. Then he does such a wonderful job of making clear as I know from my own physics background, the implications of absolute free fall. And the measurements for Trade Tower 7 are that the building from the initial stage of its collapse coming down for at least the first roughly 100 feet was absolute free fall to within measurement errors. And that means to a physicist like myself that there's no available energy for converting into transverse modes to any expulsions out the side or anything else. Everything is totally involved in this gravitational collapse. And so the kinds of arguments made in when one admits free fall, as the NIST report has done, the implications are profound and not consistent with their conclusions.
Right, and I heard somebody say on another show when they talked to their physics teacher about this, it was a college student, but he said that you have to pretty much delete 8 stories from the fall for this to make sense, for this to be possible. You literally have to erase those stories when this thing is falling, and obviously, nobody can erase floors or stories from a building on that day. So this, the implications are huge. You're totally right about that. Now, you guys have a new paper out, and I'm going to ask Tim first. Can you talk about this paper a little bit? What is the paper about?
So this paper is about trying to get at the root of what is out there in terms of good technical expertise about the trade towers and what has been published in responsible scientific and technical literature. And I raised this question a number of years ago with David Griffin, and then he referred me to someone else. I believe it was Greg Roberts, who sent a list of what was known at the time, basically compiled by somebody who was a pro-official theory person. They had a list of some 30 papers, most of which were not peer-reviewed. And then I looked at this and I thought, gee, is this all that's available? So then I began looking at, over the coming year or so after that time, what really is in the literature. So then through the Library of Congress, which is nearby to me, I then accessed databases to do the search of the peer-reviewed literature and did a preliminary search, which then revealed quite astonishing results that this paper in question now is the final output of doing that more rigorously.
Now, Jonathan, there's been a lot of papers written about 9/11, of course, and what about this paper that you guys wrote? What about the subject of it stands out and prompted you guys to actually feel the need to put a new paper out about the subject?
Well, I think just to back up a little bit, I think people need to understand that there are all sorts of articles written about this entire topic of 9/11, but I think there's two fundamental differences or two fundamental types of articles and or papers out there. And the two fundamental types are non-peer-reviewed and peer-reviewed. Okay, well, peer-reviewed papers are nothing more than papers that have been kind of thoroughly gone over by other professionals or people in similar fields to review and add input. Now, just because it's peer-reviewed does not necessarily mean that the paper is absolutely correct. However, as a group, peer-reviewed papers are kind of a higher level or higher order of research than non-peer-reviewed papers. So they kind of lend more credibility than just an article in a newspaper, if you will. So it's kind of a level up, and it's an important issue that Tim brings up. And I met Tim, by the way, at the Toronto hearings. It was this whole idea was his idea, and that was let's take a look at how many peer-reviewed papers are out there that discusses the mechanisms of collapse of the Twin Towers or World Trade Center 7. And fundamentally, we broke it down into two different things. Fundamentally, there are two theories out there. One is the official theory, and that is that the Twin Towers and World Trade Center 7 both collapsed naturally, if you will, due to a fire. Okay, the plane started the fire heated the steel and everything in there, and then it was a natural, gravitational, progressive collapse. That's the base theory that everybody is pushing, especially those that support the official theory. The other primary theory that's out there is that those Twin Towers and Building 7 had to have been brought down with some additional energy, or they had to have been brought down by some type of man-made controlled demolition. So Tim broke it down into what he calls the PC theory, or progressive collapse theory, versus the CD theory, or the controlled demolition theory. We're not saying exactly how the controlled demolition was, but we broke it down into the different types of papers that supported one or the other. And I think some of the conclusions are that what are kind of remarkable here is that in the early years, all the papers, of course, supported the official story that is some type of progressive collapse, that it was a naturally occurring collapse. But as time went on and more was learned about this, now it's flipped over. Now we have more papers that support the controlled demolition theory than the progressive collapse theory. Not only that, I think we also point out in one of the conclusions that normally when you have a scientific investigation or a scientific research into something, the more data you collect, the closer we tend to hone in on what the solution to that scientific problem is. For example, we used to think the Earth was the center of the universe, and we said, oh, no, maybe the sun's the center of the universe, and, well, maybe it's a round orbit. No, as we look more, no, actually it's an elliptical orbit. But we kind of hone into as far as what is the mechanism that makes things work. Well, in the case of 9/11, just the opposite is happening. Rather than hone in more and more as time goes on, what's happening is it's diverging. And we're getting two primary schools of thought here, and what's happening is the controlled demolition theory is overwhelming the progressive collapse theory as time goes on. So to me, that's kind of one of the interesting things that's coming out of all this. And we just looked, of course, at the first 10 or 11 years of papers out there.
Now, it's interesting. I'm going to just throw this out, and either of you guys who want to answer, go ahead. But, I mentioned that year 2005, and I read your paper, and why do you think you saw mostly papers supporting progressive collapse theory until 2005 when that changed? What do you think changed in the public discourse?
Well, Tim, you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah. My impression is that it's, so to speak, the context of all the elements related to the 9/11 question, that as information about all the different facets of this problem came together more and more, and that people like David Griffin and others began more, and the 9/11 Truth Group began under Richard Gage's leadership and others, that more and more people got exposed to not in a segmented way, but we all began to connect the dots in a new way. And so I think that was a significant contributor, and I think there was a coming together of that kind of insight in the time frame of 2005 to 2007, roughly. And of course, as you know, Trade Tower 7, the very fact of it wasn't in the 9/11 Commission report. It wasn't there at all. That's amazing. And it wasn't in mainstream media until something like 5 years after 2001. That's also amazing. But then once it became, people became aware of some of these features. For example, becoming aware of Trade Tower 7 and becoming aware of the fact that even in the NIST report, it admits it was an absolute free fall. Then people who are responsible people looking at this carefully, and not just scientists and engineers, but others, realize that at the very least, we need a new investigation. And that's been the focus of the 9/11 group. But in addition, when one looks under the hood carefully, the argument for and case for controlled demolition is really exceedingly strong.
Right, I agree with you, and I have my own theories about that. I've actually pondered this sometimes, by myself, and I think about, I was in college when 9/11 happened, and I remember back then there were, a lot of people had computers, but a lot of people still had to go to the computer lab at school in order to do their internet research and things like that. So what's changed is the availability of technology, but also too the user-created content, because it was still a system at one one point where you had an editor. You had somebody editing the information that you get. But when you had the advent of YouTube and other things that are based on user contributions, people started talking to each other. People started openly discussing this science and seeing things that they would not have seen from the normal gatekeepers. Plus, you have the element, too, where, the event had just happened. A lot of people would not even hear anything like that. The emotion was kicking in. I got an email a few days after the attack of someone saying there had to be bombs in the building, and I just politely deleted it because I didn't even take it seriously. It takes years for people to kind of step back and look at that. So that's my theory on that. Now, in the paper, you guys write, the diversity and complexity of the 9/11 events make it very difficult for most citizens and even many researchers to obtain the quality information needed to address and resolve the above questions. And the above questions cited there are about public safety implications of the Twin Towers and Building 7 destructions if the progressive collapse theory were true. And that's a very common sense argument. Obviously, if a building can just collapse because of random fires, that's a huge public safety issue suddenly now. So can you guys elaborate on this information that's not available that you cite in that passage?
Sure, I can jump in here real quick. I think the average person reads what they read in the newspaper, or they read a Popular Mechanics a magazine. The average person, I don't even think, has the inclination to really dig into this issue deeply. For a lot of reasons, obviously. It's uncomfortable. They have other things to do in life, and they feel, well, what can I do about it, probably among other reasons. But nevertheless, the information that's out there is far, far deeper to the average person if they really want to be interested in finding out how those buildings came down. But to do that, you have to dig into some of the scientific papers, and you have to read them and research them. But the average person I think just glosses over it and doesn't, just kind of takes what they read in the paper as gospel, and I think that's probably one of the basic problems of why it's not, why this information's not being spread.
Right, and it's funny, too, because, something like this, it is very technical, and I've joked about doing this show and being into the 9/11 science truth movement. I'm a regular guy. I don't have your degrees that you guys have, so I always say that I'm doing my homework. It feels like I'm doing homework, or I'm taking some kind of class. I got to get my paper done. That's like with this show. But your average person who may not be interested in engineering issues or physics may not even bother to dig into this because they'll feel it's overwhelming, and then they'll be presented computer models by somebody who's presented as an expert by the flickery blue box in their living room, and they'll defer to that, and because they don't feel that they can challenge that. And you also have an issue too where information is being suppressed, and that what I'm referring to is the data on the WTC 7 collapse models by NIST being withheld for public safety. That's one example of that that I see. And I'm just going to ask you guys this too, just offhand question. What do you think is going on there? I mean, could there be any reasonable explanation for why that data would be withheld? Any kind of public safety concerns that you could think of for why they shouldn't release their computer model data on World Trade Center 7?
My opinion is absolutely not. If anything, if it is a public safety issue, then by all means, let other engineers and research people take a look at it so they can analyze it, so we can prevent future collapses if indeed fire brought down WTC 7. So really, it's just the opposite. Or maybe it's how you read public safety. It may not. I think the inference is it's a public safety issue for buildings somehow, even though this building is long gone and there's not another one built similar to it right now. Or is it a public safety issue because once it's exposed that the input model is illogical or doesn't make sense or skews the data, is it a public safety issue for those that are in control of the public? I don't know. But I don't think I can't see where it would be any type of public safety issue relative to buildings or structures.
Well, maybe they're worried about eyes being poked out and burns from all the torches and pitchforks that would be in people's hands in the streets. I'm not certain.
I would agree.
I fully agree with that assessment. But further, there was a recent paper by Kevin Ryan that looked at, in some detail, at fire code regulations and building codes. and looked at this over the last 10 years and found out and reported on this that there has been no substantive change to a building or fire code in that 10 years that has anything to do with the destruction of Twin Towers 1, 2, and 7, which anyone looking at that result must consider extremely anomalous if one holds to the official theory, which my interpretation of that is that professionals responsible for those codes know better.
Right, that's a major issue, and it's something I cited last week, and it's the basic common sense argument for why this needs to be reinvestigated. And there was a guy on C-SPAN. I didn't call into the show. I didn't have a chance to. He was on there to talk about worker issues, worker safety issues. But I was almost thinking of calling in and sarcastically asking something to the effect of, since a 47-story steel frame high-rise can now collapse because of random fires, does this call into question the safety of people who work in steel frame high rises if a fire breaks out with the building falling on their heads? I didn't get a chance to get that question in, but that is a major issue here. Even if you want to stick to the official story, is what the heck happened there? And it's treated as if it's some kind of minor footnote. It's not even mentioned in the World Trade Center building, or it's not even mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report, Building 7, and that's a major element of this crime. Even if you want to believe the official story, we have one of the biggest structural failures in history taking place here. It deserves further analysis so we can prevent this from ever happening again. So I agree with you guys completely, and I love that you guys have cited that, because that is the most basic common sense argument for any of the stuff that I think could appeal to anybody, even the stubborn debunkers.
Yeah, it seems to me on the face of it that result is implicitly a demonstration that experts worldwide that are responsible for building codes effectively deny the official theory.
Exactly. And so, again, just reiterate what I said. This calls into question, this justifies the need for a new investigation, even if you believe the official story. You want to prevent this from ever happening again. Now, something that I always openly lament here on this show is how this issue has gotten in the way of people basically getting along in our country. People who might have been friendly with each other if they had met prior to 2001 are now at each other's throats over this issue. And I want to ask you guys, from your own observations, what role do you feel NIST itself and the corporate media has played in fueling the heat placed on this issue?
Are you talking about what role has NIST and the media been placed as far as the people like us that are out there questioning the official story?
And adding, and basically creating this, turning what should be a reasonable debate into a do-or-die screaming match.
Okay. Well, I think first of all, by their mere label as anybody questioning any official government story, as some type of, by name calling them, by calling them a conspiracy theorist, I think that's their first, shot across the bow to try to discourage any kind of looking into any issue out there. And so by their very fact that they won't even be open to a discussion or open to a reasonable research on this thing and try to get some reasonable answers, I think that starts off not really boding well for the mainstream media. They tend to always favor the government side of the story. And by the way, if I can just touch real briefly on theories, this name conspiracy theory, and it's meant as a derogatory name for people who look into things, who actually research. I just received a brand new physics book, University Physics, and on page 2, it says, the meaning of the word theory, calling an idea a theory does not mean that it's just a random thought or unproven concept. Rather, it's an explanation of natural phenomenon based upon observation and accepted fundamental principles. And so the natural phenomenon we're discussing here is exactly how do those 3 skyscrapers fall down and get destroyed so completely after they were hit by those 2 planes. But to say that anybody looking into this is a conspiracy theorist is completely unfair, I think, right off the bat. I think it's intentional.
Well, yeah, I believe it's intentional too. And you guys talk in the paper about the definition of conspiracy, but that doesn't just relate to a controlled demolition theory, but it also relates to the progressive collapse theory. Because even if you want to take the 9/11 Commission report as gospel, even if you want to take popular mechanics as gospel, you're still believing that there was a conspiracy. You think it was a conspiracy of 19 guys with box cutters. That's their conspiracy theory. But the term conspiracy theory, if they really want to drag it out and throw it out there, applies to progressive collapse theory as well, as controlled demolition theory.
Yeah, exactly. If we stick to the dictionary definition instead of utilizing a pejorative usage of that phrase, exactly right. But now the issue with our paper was, we have these two theories. We have the progressive collapse hypothesis, PC we call it, and we have the controlled demolition hypothesis, CD. Then we should look at data and evidence to help distinguish and test between these alternate hypotheses for given physical phenomena, and that's what we're trying to use the peer-reviewed literature as an important vehicle to help do that.
Right. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the paper here. And can you talk about the analysis results of your paper's literature search?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what I did was to access two major databases with John's assistance. First, I accessed the Academic Search Complete database from EBSCO, EBSCO, which one can get from EBSCOhost.com, and then get through and you can get direct access through, say, a local regional library or research library, or you can pay to subscribe. The other one is the Thomson Reuters Web of Science database, which I had access via connections through a nearby NASA center. And I used these databases to do a systematic search in the EBSCO database over 5,100 peer-reviewed journals worldwide, and for the Web of Science database, over 3,500 science and technical journals worldwide, and searching comprehensively for all relevant papers based upon their titles and abstracts, every such paper that met the criteria. And this involved looking over 11 years for the two databases, looking at more than 10,000 records.
Wow, yeah, and I read that, and it's just really interesting, some of the findings that you made, and one of them was that most of the papers supporting the progressive collapse theory went until about 2005, and then we see this change. And you say in the paper, the vast majority of independent investigations about other catastrophes narrow down and converge on the solution as more and better information is obtained. Theories that do not or cannot explain the additional information are discarded, resulting in a theory that earns general scientific consensus. Precisely the opposite has happened over the past decade with the study of how the World Trade Center structures fell. That is, the more information that has been unearthed, the more unanswered questions have arisen with the official hypothesis, with more people questioning the initial theory.
John elaborated on that somewhat earlier, and let me just say a few words myself and then pass back to John. That is, we're talking about basically the scientific process and the techniques we use to look at some new phenomena that we don't already have well in hand or don't understand, and then really gather various observations, evaluate the possible ways to characterize that phenomena, perhaps identify appropriate parameters that you'll provide measurements of as effectively as you can, and then carry out those sets of measurements, and then evaluate the results of that set of measurements and observations in some ever more systematic way, and try to focus in more and more on viable hypotheses for explaining a certain event. And that systematic process, basically the scientific process, is one that has worked most effectively for the last few hundred years and needs to be applied. And I think there are clearly ways in this case for the trade tower collapse and that issue, in which many aspects of good scientific methodology was simply not applied and were undermined or diverted. John.
Yeah, again, just to kind of rehash a little bit again, as we learn more and more information for any scientific endeavor, we discard any theory that cannot explain the evidence or the phenomenon that we observe, and then we establish new hypotheses to help explain that new data and those new observations. And what's happened here is once the official story was told or sold to us, there was anytime there was new information added, it was either ignored or downplayed or dismissed because that new evidence and data went against the official story. Well, in real science and real scientific investigations, when that new data comes in, you don't ignore it. You put it on the table and you try to explain it. And since they can't explain a lot of the items, the free fall, the uniform acceleration, the missing jolt, the eutectic steel, the nanothermite, when all this new evidence comes in and they cannot explain it, well, they do just the opposite of what any normal scientific investigation would do. They ignore it or downplay it, which is completely contrary to the scientific method.
Well, one dramatic example of that, I can think of several, but one dramatic example is the fact of explosions in the vicinity of the trade towers, which have been documented in considerable detail through evaluation of the first-person responder and associated interviews that were then released in 2005 that Rand McCain carried out and was then published in Journal of 9/11 Studies. But in addition to all of that kind of evidence of people directly reporting in multiple ways the fact of explosions, was also audio recordings that in one of the interviews being done, you have an audio recording, and in the background, in the audio track, you have the signatures of the explosions of Trade Tower 7, and when you do a frequency transform of that to look at to isolate that soundtrack and identify the frequency of that, it was exactly associated with the kind of signature you would expect with controlled demolition. So this is new evidence, and it was it's been totally ignored by those that promote the official conspiracy theory.
Right, and speaking of new evidence, a couple of weeks ago, I sent you guys the clip ahead of time before the show, but I contacted John McCain and asked him about free fall acceleration on Building 7. He said he'd get in touch with my office. I tried to get in touch with his office, but I've not heard from them, amazingly. And Blair Gatsby, an activist out there in Arizona, held a hunger strike in front of McCain's office in 2008, and they did prompt McCain to write a letter to him, basically dismissing him, but saying if there's any new science-based evidence, and I'm paraphrasing, please get in touch with me. So this qualifies as the new science-based evidence, everything we are talking about. I'm going to ask you guys, I don't know if you both saw the clip. I know you did, Jonathan. What is your reaction to John McCain claiming ignorance on this and his inability, or his staff's inability to get back in touch with me about this important issue?
Well, first of all, I think John McCain is well aware of it. He's not an ignorant person whatsoever. In fact, I think, as you pointed out, he kind of wrote an introduction to the whole 9/11 debunking book a few years ago. So he's well aware, I think, of the issues out there, because I think those touch on the whole fall of World Trade Center 7. So to claim that he's ignorant of, I don't know if he's claiming he's ignorant of the fall of World Trade Center 7, which looks like an obvious controlled demolition, by the way, but to claim he's ignorant of it and then will get back to us and look at it and then not follow up, well, I think that's just kind of indicative of a normal brush off when they're posed with very difficult questions that are unanswerable. They cannot answer these questions. And so what do? They have to sidestep. They have to do a little, shuck and jive and plead ignorance and, quote, have their staff get back to them. And, of course, staff never really gets back to them. Or they'll send them a link to, say, a 9/11 debunking site as the answer. And then when you ask them later on, they say, well, we've already answered that. We sent them a link to this thing, which effectively answers it. So I think it's just a normal brush-off, which would be pretty typical for a politician or anybody who supports the official story.
Well, related to that, you just mentioned in the political sphere, as well as for many of those in the mainstream media, they're focused on, so to speak, what I would think of as advocacy-based thinking. That is, you're trying to frame a certain policy or a certain goal or a certain way of understanding something, and then you're sort of filtering the data to be able to support and project that particular perspective or framing of an issue, as opposed to evidence-based thinking or data-driven approaches, which is more that of scientists and technologists and engineers like myself and like John and I, in which we ask for evidence and for ways to explicitly and carefully test between alternatives. So I think McCain, he's part of a political system. They're focused on an advocacy-based approach, and if a particular set of evidence doesn't support the particular advocacy you wish to promote, it gets filtered out.
Right, and you guys, go ahead.
I was going to say, and the funny thing is that, of course, when he wrote his foreword of the Popular Mechanics book, he says, quote, any explanation for 9/11 must start and end with the facts. The evidence must be gathered and analyzed. Then and only then can conclusions be drawn. So he says the buzzwords. He talks the talk, but he doesn't walk the walk. What he says and what he does, of course, are two different things.
Right, and that's the case with many politicians, and I'll take it at face value, but I sometimes wonder if he actually wrote any of those words. I can never know. But something you guys wrote about in the paper is this quote from the National Academy of Science. It says, researchers deepen knowledge about the fallibility of human decision-making, particularly the many cognitive biases to which people are subject. And I see this myself as that people don't want to go there. Their minds don't want to go there. They are angry at just any kind of skeptical inquiry, any kind of reasonable inquiry into this event. And I can hear that in what you guys are saying in your response to that. And I want to make sure that I get to this on the show, so I'm going to kind of jump into it. But, we had Richard Gage, Bob McIlvaine, and Deborah Voorhees on a couple of weeks ago to respond to an attack by Rachel Maddow of MSNBC. I say the term attack loosely because it didn't really have any teeth to it. It was just her kind of going off on a rant about not liking conspiracy theories. And she doesn't really debunk anything. She doesn't really cite any facts. She just appeals to the so-called authority of the 9/11 Commission report and what she calls the definitive work on, or the definitive book on the 9/11 attacks, and the Popular Mechanics book. I want to hear you guys, because you guys know what you're talking about. I want to hear your responses to that Rachel Maddow piece.
Sure. Yeah, when it comes to showing a person an article that may be published in a magazine or that you may have written that has not been peer-reviewed and that supports the CD, the controlled demolition hypothesis, they usually brush it off and say, oh, well, that's not a peer-reviewed publication, so, it really has no merit. And yet, on the other hand, Rachel Maddow gets on TV and talks to millions of people, and she's decided to lend her 9/11 expertise to the debate. She said, as you pointed out, that two of the best books about the 9/11 attacks are the 9/11 Commission report, which she says is the definitive report. But that definitive report forgot to mention even the collapse of Building 7, or the iron microspheres, or the free fall, or the uniform acceleration, or the missing jolt, or the eutectic steel, or the nanothermite, and virtually every single issue that's in contention on this issue. So for being a definitive report, it sure forgot to mention a whole bunch of things. Moreover, she says that even better than the official 9/11 report was the official 9/11 comic book, which he also considers to be a fine work about the event that she highly recommends. And then her second book she talks about is the Popular Mechanics 9/11 Myths book, and I actually touched on that book at the Toronto hearings briefly. That was supposedly written by the geeks at Popular Mechanics to address all the scientific issues. Once again, though, those geeks forgot to mention the source of the sulfur that we talk about in eutectic steel. They never did mention that. They didn't mention the intergranular melting, the uniform downward acceleration of the towers, which implies that there was no jolt or any mechanism to amplify the downward force. They didn't mention the implication of free fall at WTC 7. They didn't mention the fact that the crush-down, crush-up Bazant theory cannot even be replicated experimentally, as well as all the other problems with the Bazant theory, such as its overestimation of the mass, the underestimation of the column strength, and most importantly, that lack of deceleration or jolt that's necessary to make his theory work. And, of course, many other critical issues. But the key thing I want to point out is that her two definitive sources, in addition to not even mentioning those key issues, were not peer-reviewed. And by the way, the NIST reports were also not peer-reviewed. So we all agree that peer review is an important thing in the scientific method. As a matter of fact, the OMB bulletin, quote, requires each agency to submit influential scientific information to peer review prior to dissemination. Yet NIST never did this with this report or their Building 7 report. They never subjected it to peer review. So one would think that the largest structural failures in history and the government's own explanation should be, as a minimum, peer-reviewed, but they're not. So her two sources, in my opinion, not being peer-reviewed, plus missing all the critical information, is kind of laughable from my take on it.
And that is funny because I've never thought about it from that point before, but you're absolutely right. That is a very valid point and something Rachel Maddow could stand to come to a conclusion on herself, though I'm not holding my breath. Tim, did you happen to see that report with Rachel Maddow?
I saw a portion of it. After so much, emotional tirade, lack of evidence, lack of any reasoned discussion, and ad hominem attacks, which is a logical fallacy, I kind of went through maybe half of it and decided that was enough. I couldn't stomach much more. I couldn't believe that she's really a person of influence in this whole thing. It's a sad state of affairs. But you see, it's that kind of thing that our good scholarship and good science and so forth needs to help neutralize and to help people cut through issues and do things in a way that is based on evidence and not on emotional projections. I mean, there may be some topics for which that might be appropriate, but when it comes to something important like this, where we've got a technical issue of the mechanism of collapse for the trade towers 1, 2, and 7, and that kind of issue, that's resolvable by a systematic scientific process, and we need to work with that process as well as we can, and rigorously so, and responsibly, to work that out. And it's clear that, as John pointed out, that the two reports she referred to were not responsible in that way. And so it's via this kind of good methodology that we can address and resolve this, and that requires a new investigation, new study, and indeed, part of the hope of our paper is that to encourage the scholarly community, especially scientists and engineers, and especially structural engineers, but the scholarly community more broadly, to take this on and look into this. And this could be done by any reader, but especially the scholarly audience, to personally check the results of our analysis for themselves of the peer-reviewed technical literature. And there's nothing more convincing than to evaluate for oneself. And what we have put on the table here is something that doesn't need to be some mystery behind a wall. Anyone in the world can access the information that's needed to check what we have described in the paper.
Right. Now, in our last minute or so, and we don't have a lot of time, but, obviously there's an urgency on this issue, and I've said it before in the show that this is more than just determining some mundane scientific controversy that can go unresolved with no consequence to humanity for years. In your opinions, what needs to be done? What's the next step to escalating this issue to a higher priority in national debate?
Well, I think one of the things, and Tim and I discussed this a little bit, is now that we have this paper out, first of all, we're welcome to anybody reviewing it and trying to discredit or whatever. The facts stand on their own. But I think if this paper stands up, and I think it will, it's just a matter of compiling what's been written before by peer-reviewed papers, But I think if this paper perhaps is forwarded maybe to some of the higher scientific entities out there, maybe the American Society of Civil Engineers, or maybe other scientific people out there, maybe it'll help, be one more thing that they can look at to help force the issue. I don't know. Tim, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. I think listeners who might have such connections to then take our paper and materials like this, such as the wonderful and substantive material of the AE 911 Truth, to share that and make it available to decision makers or people that are in a position to evaluate in more detail. But more substantive work needs to be done on this. I mean, by, say, specialists. Like, I would appeal to those in structural engineering worldwide to please do something to look into this. I mean, like when we did this investigation, we found a total of only 59 distinct papers that met our criteria of either progressive collapse hypothesis or controlled demolition that met our criteria and that passed peer review. That's an astonishingly small number of peer-reviewed papers on an issue of such tremendous international importance. If this was any other area of science and engineering whatsoever, of even a much smaller consequence, there would be far more such papers that would be in the literature. And indeed, we found that there were only in the first 10 years, there were 31 distinct controlled demolition papers, and there were 14 distinct progressive collapse papers. And of the set of papers concluding with progressive collapse, in the first 10 years, 0 of them addressed Trade Tower 7. None. And I find this just unbelievable. Even though there was then, in the follow-on year, a paper from the NIST group that addressed Tower 7. So this is an important area that needs attention by the scholarly community, and so much more needs to be done.
You're absolutely right. And folks, you're listening right now. It's up to you. You got to spread this information and do what they say. Bring this to structural engineers all across the world. Guys, this has been an amazing hour. It's gone by very fast for me. I want to thank you for coming on 9/11 Freefall. Folks, don't forget, you can listen to the show every Thursday night at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific on No Lies Radio. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.